In a quiet town in New England, Robert, a 65-year-old man, is nervously tightening a silk tie he has kept hidden for years. He is about to take a long flight to meet Martha, the woman who has listened to his piano melodies every night and shared her deepest stories with him for months. But why, every time he proposed a meeting, did she push it away with mysterious excuses? A shocking truth is waiting for him at a seaside cafe, a discovery that could make him walk away forever, or bind them together for the rest of their lives. Please support us by subscribing to our channel for more touching tales. The morning mist in Vermont has a way of clinging to the pine trees like a soft wool blanket. Robert stood by his kitchen window. The steam from his French press rose in a slow and steady curl. He watched the sunlight struggle to break through the gray horizon. It was quiet. It was always quiet. He was a man of precision. 40 years as a civil engineer had taught him that the world functioned on structure and balance. Now that he was retired, that structure was all he had left. He pressed the plunger down. The scent of dark roast filled the room. It was a good smell, but it was a smell he enjoyed alone. Robert took his mug and stepped out onto the back porch. His boots made a soft thud against the cedar wood. The air was crisp. It tasted of damp earth and the coming winter. Below the porch, his rose garden lay in its final sleep of the season. He had spent the summer pruning every stem. He knew every thorn and every petal. The roses were beautiful, but roses do not speak back. He walked through his house. Every floorboard was polished. Every book was aligned on the shelf. It was a magnificent home. He had designed the expansion himself. He had picked the oak for the stairs. He had chosen the stone for the hearth. Yet as he passed the empty dining room table, the silence felt heavy. The house was too large. The ceilings were too high. His own footsteps seemed to echo with a hollow ring that he could not ignore. In the corner of the living room sat his most prized possession, a vintage Steinway piano. The wood was dark and deep. The ivory keys were slightly yellowed with age. Robert sat down on the bench. He ran his fingers across the lid. This piano had been his companion through everything. It knew his frustrations. It knew his triumphs. He began to play. The first few notes were soft, a simple melody, something slow and nostalgic. The music filled the corners of the room. It drifted up to the rafters. For a moment the house did not feel so empty. For a moment the ghosts of old conversations seemed to dance in the shadows. But when the final chord faded, the silence returned. It felt even colder than before. He closed his eyes. He missed the sound of another person in the kitchen. He missed the clinking of plates. He missed the simple sound of a voice asking how he had slept. Freedom was a wonderful gift, but shared freedom was better. Later that afternoon, his old friend Miller stopped by. Miller was a man who couldn't stand a quiet room. They sat in the garden chairs. Robert served him tea. "Robert, you are fading away in this museum of yours." Miller said it with a laugh, but his eyes were serious. "You have a heart full of music and a head full of stories. Why are you keeping them all to yourself?" Robert looked at his roses. "I am 65 years old, Miller. The time for new stories is likely behind me." "Nonsense." Miller pulled a small device from his pocket. "The world has changed. People are finding each other across oceans with the tap of a finger. There is an app. It is for people like you. People who value a conversation over a quick glance. Just try it." Robert resisted at first. The idea felt strange. It felt desperate. But that night the house felt particularly vast. The wind howled through the New England hills. He sat in his armchair. He held his phone in his hand. He downloaded the app. He began to fill out the profile. He did not talk about his career or his bank account. He wrote about the way the light hits the mountains in October. He wrote about the feeling of a perfect C major chord on an old piano. He wrote about the books he read twice. He chose a photo of himself in his garden. He looked older, yes, but his eyes were kind. He took a deep breath. He clicked the button to join. Suddenly the screen came to life. Faces appeared. names from places he had never been, interests that he had never shared. He felt like a sailor casting a net into a dark and unknown sea. He was about to put the phone away. He felt a bit foolish. But then a notification appeared. A small icon blinked. Someone had liked his description of the piano. He clicked on the profile. Her name was Martha. She lived thousands of miles away, but she had a smile that felt familiar. Her eyes were bright and full of a quiet wisdom. She was a writer. Robert felt a strange spark. It was a flutter in his chest he had not felt in a long time. He began to type a message. His hands were a little shaky. "Hello, Martha," he wrote. "I see you appreciate a good piano. It is the only thing that keeps my house from being too quiet." He sent the message. He looked around his empty living room. The silence was still there, but for the first time in many years, it felt like the silence was waiting for an answer. The journey had begun. The notification on Robert's phone felt like a tiny heartbeat in the palm of his hand. He had spent decades building bridges and roads, but he had never built a connection quite like this. Her name was Martha. She lived in a sun-drenched town in California, thousands of miles away from the chilly winds of Vermont. She was a writer, 45 years old. A woman with a voice that sounded like warm honey and eyes that seemed to see right through the screen. It began with simple messages, a comment on a poem, a question about a book. But soon the messages turned into letters, long, deep, honest. They did not talk about the weather or the news of the day. They talked about the things that truly mattered. They discussed the architecture of a Beethoven sonata. They debated the meaning of a single line of poetry. They shared their thoughts on what it means to be human in a world that is often too loud. Martha was a soul of resilience. She told him about the stories she wrote, stories of people who lost everything and found the strength to keep walking. Robert listened with a fascination he had not felt in years. He realized that while he had been building structures out of steel and stone, she had been building them out of words and emotions. Then came the phone calls. The first time he heard her voice, Robert felt a flush of heat in his cheeks. It was a soft, melodic laugh that reminded him of a summer breeze. "Robert." She said his name with a gentle lilt. "I have been waiting to hear your voice. I was afraid I would have nothing to say," Robert admitted. "You play the piano, Robert," she replied. "A man who plays like that always has something to say." So he played for her. He began to carry his phone to the living room every evening. He would prop it up on the edge of the Steinway. The screen would show the ceiling of her room or a stack of her books. And he would play. He played the Moonlight Sonata. The notes drifted from the snowy mountains of Vermont and traveled through the airwaves. They landed in her quiet home in California. When he finished, there would be a long silence. A beautiful silence. "I can feel the music, Robert," she whispered one night. "It feels like you are right here in the room with me." Robert felt a lump in his throat. In those moments, the 3,000 miles between them did not exist. The map of the United States was nothing more than a piece of paper. His heart was in California, and hers was in Vermont. The nights became shorter. They would stay awake until the stars began to fade and the first hint of blue touched the sky. Martha would read her scripts to him. She had a way of bringing characters to life. She spoke of hope. She spoke of the light that remains even after a great storm. Robert would sit in his armchair, his eyes closed. He hung on every word. He found himself changing. The precision of his life began to soften. He didn't care if the dishes were washed immediately. He didn't care if the rose garden needed weeding. He was busy thinking of the next song he would play for her. He was busy wondering what she would read next. He felt young, truly young. The silver in his hair did not matter. The lines on his face did not matter. He was a man in love. It was a slow, steady burn, like a fire that had been buried under ash for years, only to be breathed back to life. His house no longer felt like a museum. It felt like a stage, a place where he could share his soul with a woman who lived on the other side of the world. Martha was a mystery. She was a light. She was the melody that had been missing from his life. Robert realized that his retirement was not an end. It was a beginning. He was no longer just an engineer. He was a man with a purpose, to listen, to play, and to love. As he watched the sunrise over the Vermont hills after another sleepless night, he smiled. He was 3,000 miles away from her. But he had never felt closer to anyone in his entire life. The snow began to fall in Vermont, big, heavy flakes that covered the porch and turned the rose garden into a world of white. Inside the warm living room, Robert sat by the fire. His phone was in his hand. He was looking at a photo Martha had sent him that morning. She was sitting in a park. The California sun was golden on her shoulders. She looked so real, so close, and yet she was an ocean of land away. Robert realized that the phone calls were no longer enough. He wanted to hear her laughter without the crackle of a digital signal. He wanted to see the way her eyes moved when she spoke about her books. He wanted to sit across a real table and pour her a real cup of coffee. The urge to see her became a physical ache. It was a hunger that music could not satisfy. "Martha," he said during their call that evening, "the winter is coming here. The house is getting cold. I want to fly out. I want to come to California and finally take you to dinner." There was a silence on the other end. It lasted a second too long. Robert felt a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the snow outside. "Oh, Robert." Her voice was soft. It sounded strained. "I would love that more than anything. But I am buried in work right now. My editor has moved up the deadline for the new script. I am barely sleeping. It is just not a good time." Robert nodded to the empty room. "I understand. A writer needs her focus. I can wait a few weeks." But a few weeks turned into a month. And every time Robert brought it up, there was a new reason: a sudden bout of the flu, an unexpected trip to visit a sick relative, a broken water pipe in her kitchen that required days of repair. The excuses began to pile up like the snowdrifts against his door. Robert was an engineer. He was trained to look for patterns. He was trained to notice when something in the structure was not aligned. A small seed of doubt began to grow in his mind. Was she real? Was she hiding a family? Was she afraid that a 65-year-old man would not fit into her world? He would sit in the dark after their calls. The fire would die down to embers. He would replay her words in his head. He wondered if he was being a fool. He wondered if he was chasing a ghost. But then they would video call. Her face would fill his screen. She always sat in that same comfortable chair. She always wore a soft sweater. The light would hit her face just right. And when she looked at him, there was no lie in her eyes. There was a depth of affection that felt as solid as the mountains. She would smile at his jokes. She would listen to his piano, playing with a devotion that was unmistakable. No, Robert told himself, a person cannot fake that kind of gaze. The eyes do not lie. He decided that Martha was simply afraid. Perhaps she was nervous about the age gap. Perhaps she was worried that the magic would fade once they were in the same room. He knew that sometimes people protect the things they love by keeping them at a distance. But Robert was tired of the distance. He believed that love was not just a feeling. Love was an action. It was a choice to show up. It was a choice to be present when things were complicated. One Tuesday morning, Robert did something he had never done. He bypassed his logic. He ignored the voice in his head that told him to be careful. He opened his laptop. He went to a travel website. He looked for flights from Burlington to Seattle. His heart was hammering against his ribs. It felt like he was a teenager again, planning to sneak out of the house. He found a flight, a direct connection. He looked at the seat map. He clicked purchase. The confirmation email arrived a moment later. It was done. In 3 days, he would be on the other side of the country. He didn't tell Miller. He didn't tell his neighbors. And most importantly, he didn't tell Martha. He spent the next 2 days in a blur of nervous energy. He cleaned the house. He made sure the piano was covered. He packed a small suitcase with his best clothes. He felt a strange mix of terror and joy. What if she was angry? What if she refused to see him? He looked at his reflection in the hallway mirror. He saw a man who had spent too much time waiting for life to happen to him. He saw a man who was finally taking a hammer to the walls of his own isolation. "If she rejects me, I will at least know the truth," he whispered to the silent hallway. "But if she welcomes me, my life will finally begin." He turned off the lights. He locked the front door. The snow was still falling, but Robert didn't feel the cold. He was headed toward the sun. He was headed toward Martha. And he was ready for whatever truth was waiting for him at the end of the journey. The air in California was different. It was thick with the scent of salt water and blooming jasmine. Robert stepped out of his rental car. He smoothed his jacket. His hands were cold, even in the warm afternoon sun. The Golden Leaf Cafe sat on a quiet corner away from the busy harbor. It was a small building with ivy crawling up the brick walls. It looked like something out of a storybook. It was exactly the kind of place Martha would choose. Robert took a deep breath. He had sent her a message from his hotel that morning. He had confessed that he was here, in her city, waiting for her. There had been a long silence, a silence that made his heart sink. But then a simple reply came through, "I will meet you at 4 o'clock, the Golden Leaf." He pushed the door open. A bell chimed above his head. The cafe was dimly lit and smelled of roasted beans and cinnamon. He looked toward the back, and there she was. Martha was sitting at a small round table in the far corner. She was wearing a cream-colored sweater. The sunlight from a high window touched her hair. She looked even more radiant than she did on the screen. Her face was soft. Her expression was one of quiet peace. But as he approached, he saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Was it fear, or was it just the same nerves that were making his own knees weak Robert? She spoke his name softly as he reached the table. Her voice was the melody he had heard 1,000 times. But hearing it in person was like hearing music for the very first time. Martha. He sat down across from her. He couldn't stop smiling. "You are real. You are finally here. I am here." She reached out and touched his hand. Her skin was warm. "I am sorry I made it so difficult for you to come." Robert shook his head. "It doesn't matter now. None of it matters." The hours began to slip away. They ordered coffee, then tea, then coffee again. The conversation flowed like a river that had finally found its path to the sea. They talked about the books they loved. They laughed about the small things. Robert told her about the quiet mountains of Vermont. Martha told her about the rhythm of the ocean. It felt as though they had known each other for 100 years. Every look, every gesture, it all felt right. Robert felt a weight lifting off his shoulders. The loneliness of his big house seemed like a distant memory. He felt like the happiest man alive. He felt like he had found his home. The sun began to dip below the horizon. The cafe began to empty. The shadows grew long across the wooden floor. "I should probably let you get some rest," Robert said reluctantly. He didn't want the moment to end, but he wanted to be a gentleman. "I would love to walk you to your car, or perhaps we could walk a bit by the water." Martha's smile faltered. The light in her eyes seemed to dim for a fraction of a second. "Robert," she said. "Wait." Robert stood up. He walked around the table to reach for her hand. He wanted to help her up. He wanted to feel her arm in his. Martha did not move. Instead, she reached down to the side of her chair. She pulled a dark metal frame from the shadows of the corner. It was a wheelchair. Robert froze. With a practiced, painful movement, Martha shifted her weight. She moved herself from the cafe chair into the wheelchair. Her legs were limp. They did not move. They were thin beneath her long skirt. The silence that followed was deafening. "I was in an accident," Martha said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were trembling. "It happened many years ago. In 2012, a car went through a red light. I haven't walked since then." Robert couldn't speak. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. This was the secret. This was the reason for the excuses. the reason for the fixed camera angles, the reason for the hesitation. Martha looked up at him. Her face was brave, but her eyes were pleading. "I wanted you to know the woman first," she whispered. "I wanted you to know my heart before you saw my reality. Because usually when people see the chair, they stop seeing me." Robert stood there in the middle of the quiet cafe. His hand was still reached out, but he didn't know what to grasp. The dream he had built for the last few days was shattering, and in its place was a reality he was not prepared to face. The air in the cafe suddenly felt very thin. Robert stood motionless. His outstretched hand hung in the air like a broken branch. The warm scent of coffee was gone. In its place was a sharp, biting coldness that started in his chest and spread to his fingertips. He looked at the metal frame of the wheelchair. He looked at the way Martha's hands gripped the wheels. He looked at the woman he thought he knew. 1,000 images flashed through his mind. He thought of the video calls where she was always sitting perfectly still. He thought of the excuses, the deadlines, the sick relatives, the broken pipes. It wasn't just the wheelchair that shocked him. It was the silence she had wrapped around it. He felt a wave of dizziness. The engineering part of his brain began to calculate the future. He saw ramps. He saw hospitals. He saw a life of caretaking and heavy lifting. He saw the quiet, easy retirement he had planned for himself beginning to crumble. He felt like a man standing on the edge of a cliff. Martha watched him. She saw the color drain from his face. She saw his eyes darting around the room, looking for an exit. She saw the moment his heart began to close. Robert tried to speak, but his throat was dry. His mind was a storm of confusion and a strange, bitter sense of betrayal. He felt as though he had been invited into a beautiful house only to find the foundation was broken. He took a step back. It was a small movement, but to Martha it was a thunderclap. The silence grew heavy. It was a physical weight between them. Robert wanted to say something kind. He wanted to be the hero he thought he was. But in this moment he was just a frightened man. He looked toward the door. The sunlight outside seemed so simple, so uncomplicated. Martha did not beg. She did not offer a long explanation. She did not cry. Instead, she reached into the canvas bag hanging from the back of her chair. She pulled out a small, neatly tied parcel. She placed it on the wooden table. "These belong to you, Robert." Her voice was incredibly calm. It was the voice of a woman who had walked through fire and expected to get burned again. Robert looked down. Through the thin paper he could see the shapes, the dried rose from his garden in Vermont, the antique book of poetry he had found in a dusty shop, the small wooden music box he had sent for her birthday. Every piece of his heart that he had mailed across the country was in that bag. "I am giving these back," Martha said. She managed a small, sad smile that broke the last of Robert's composure. "I am giving them back because I knew this day would come. I knew that when the screen turned off and the reality turned on, the music might stop." Robert reached out and touched the parcel. The paper was cool. He wanted to say he was sorry. He wanted to say he understood. But the words were stuck behind a wall of fear. He remained silent. A cold, heavy silence that felt like a final sentence. Martha nodded slowly. She had seen this reaction before. She adjusted her grip on the wheels of her chair. She didn't look back. "Take care of your piano, Robert," she whispered. "It is a beautiful instrument." She turned the chair with a graceful, fluid motion. The soft whir of the wheels on the wooden floor was the only sound in the cafe. Robert stood there, paralyzed by his own indecision. He watched her move toward the door. She looked so small in that large metal frame. But as she pushed the door open and rolled out into the bright California sun, she looked incredibly dignified. She didn't slump her shoulders. She didn't look down. She moved with a quiet strength that made the entire cafe feel empty. The bell above the door chimed one last time. Then the door swung shut. Robert was alone. He looked at the empty chair where she had sat. He looked at the parcel of returned gifts. The silence returned, but this time It wasn't the peaceful silence of his mountains. It was a hollow, haunting silence. A silence that told him he had just let something priceless walk or roll out of his life. He stood in the shadows of the Golden Leaf Cafe. His heart was beating slow and heavy. He had come 3,000 miles to find his soulmate, and in 1 minute of fear, he had let her go. The bell above the cafe door was still vibrating. Robert stood in the center of the room. He was surrounded by empty tables and the smell of stale coffee. The parcel of returned gifts sat on the table like a tombstone. He looked at his hands. They were shaking. He looked at the door. Martha was gone. A sudden sharp memory pierced through his shock. He remembered a night when the snow was thick against his windows in Vermont. He remembered Martha's voice over the phone. She had read him a story about a bird with a broken wing that still taught the forest how to sing. He remembered how he had cried that night, not because he was sad, but because he felt understood for the first time in his life. He realized something that hit him harder than the side of the wheelchair. He had spent his whole life building bridges out of concrete, but Martha had built a bridge out of light and music. She had reached across 3,000 miles to save him from his own loneliness, and when she needed him to walk across that bridge, he had turned away. He saw his future in that moment. He saw himself returning to Vermont. He saw himself sitting at his Steinway piano in the silence. He realized that without Martha, the music would be hollow. The rose garden would be just a collection of thorns. The house would be a grave. He didn't care about the ramps. He didn't care about the hospitals. He didn't care about the heavy lifting. He only cared about the woman who knew the song in his heart. "What am I doing?" he whispered. The words broke the spell of his fear. Robert turned. He didn't walk. He ran. He pushed the cafe door open so hard the bell clattered against the glass. The bright California sun blinded him for a second. He squinted against the glare. There, a block away. A small figure in a wheelchair was moving steadily down the sidewalk. She was moving toward the parking structure. She was moving out of his life. "Martha," he shouted. His voice was raw. It was the sound of a man who was finally waking up. She didn't stop. Maybe she didn't hear him. Maybe she didn't want to hear him. Robert ran faster. His lungs burned. His legs ached. He didn't look like a dignified retired engineer anymore. He looked like a man desperate to catch a miracle before it disappeared. He reached her just as she was about to turn the corner. He reached out and caught the handle of her wheelchair. The chair came to a sudden halt. Martha turned her head. Her face was wet with tears she hadn't allowed him to see in the cafe. Her eyes were full of a tired, painful hope. "Robert," she breathed, "please, don't make this harder. I was a fool." Robert gasped for air. He dropped to his knees right there on the concrete sidewalk. He didn't care who was watching. He didn't care about his polished shoes or his pressed trousers. He took her hands in his. They were cold as ice. "I was scared, Martha." He looked directly into her eyes. "I saw the chair, and I forgot to see you. But when you walked out that door, I realized that I don't want a life with someone who can walk. I want a life with you." Martha shook her head, a sob breaking from her throat. "It is not easy, Robert. The world is not built for people like me. You came here for a dream. This is not a dream." Robert squeezed her hands. "Then we will build a new one. I am an engineer. Remember, I spent 40 years building things that last. Let me build a life for us." He reached up and wiped a tear from her cheek. "I promised I would play for you forever. I meant it. If you can't walk, then I will be your legs. I will carry you if I have to. But please, do not make me go back to that silent house alone." Martha looked at him for a long time. She saw the honesty in his silver eyes. She saw the man who had played Chopin for her until the sun came up. She leaned forward. She wrapped her arms around his neck and pulled him close. They clung to each other in the middle of the busy sidewalk, two people who had been broken in different ways, finally finding the peace that made them whole. The sun began to set over the Pacific Ocean. The light turned the street into a river of gold. Robert stood up. He didn't let go of her hand. He walked behind the chair. He gripped the handles. Where to? he asked. His voice was steady now. "Home," she whispered. Robert began to push. Every step he took felt lighter than the one before. He wasn't just pushing a wheelchair, he was moving toward his future, and for the first time in his life, he knew exactly where he was going. The for sale sign stood in the front yard of the house in Vermont for only a few weeks. Robert watched from the porch as a young couple walked through the rooms he had polished for so many years. He did not feel sad. He did not feel like he was losing anything. Instead, he felt like a traveler, shedding a heavy coat before stepping into the sun. He packed his life into a few sturdy boxes. The Steinway piano was the most difficult to move. It required a special team and a long journey across the country. But Robert did not mind the cost or the effort. The music belonged wherever she was. The move to California was not just a change of address. It was a change of soul. Their new home was small and filled with light. It sat on a quiet street where the air smelled of salt and lemon blossoms. Robert had spent the first month making adjustments. He lowered the light switches. He removed the thick carpet so the wheels could move without effort. He built a wide wooden deck where they could sit together in the evenings. He used his skills as an engineer to build a world that was seamless for Martha. Now the mornings had a beautiful rhythm. Robert would wake up early. The California sun would stream through the white curtains. He would walk into the kitchen and start the coffee. The sound of the beans grinding was the first note of their daily song. He would bring a tray into the sunroom. Martha was always there before him. She sat in her wheelchair by the large bay window. The light caught the silver in her hair and the focus in her eyes. She was back to her writing. Her fingers danced across the keys of her laptop with a new kind of energy. She was no longer writing about ghosts or distant dreams. She was writing about the beauty of the present moment. Robert would set her mug down. She would look up and smile. It was a look of deep, quiet belonging. "Thank you, Robert," she would say. He would squeeze her hand. He would look at the way the morning light touched the room. Everything was in its right place. In the afternoons, the house became a concert hall. The Steinway had found its new corner. It sat near the window where the breeze would catch the music and carry it outside. Robert sat on the bench. He would play the pieces they had discussed over the phone during those long, lonely nights. But the music sounded different now. It was richer. It was fuller. It carried the weight of a promise kept. Martha would roll her chair close to the piano. She would watch his hands move over the ivory. Sometimes she would stop writing and simply close her eyes. She would let the melody wash over her. One evening, as the sky turned a deep shade of violet and pink, Robert played a slow, gentle waltz. It was a piece he had composed just for her. It was a song about a bridge built across 3,000 miles. When the final note faded into the quiet room, Martha moved her chair even closer. She reached out and rested her hand on his arm. She leaned her head against his shoulder. Robert stayed very still. He rested his cheek against her hair. The house was silent, but it was a full silence. It was a silence filled with the presence of another person. "I never thought I would find this," Martha whispered. "I thought I would always be a voice in a machine." Robert took a deep breath. He looked at the wheelchair. He looked at the years ahead of them. He thought about the challenges of her disability and the limits of his own age, but none of it felt like a burden. "We are not voices anymore, Martha," he said softly. "We are home." He realized then that he had spent his entire life looking for perfection. He had wanted the perfect career, the perfect house, the perfect plan for retirement. But true happiness was something much more profound. It was the sight of a wheelchair in the hallway. It was the sound of a French press in the morning. It was the feeling of a head resting on a shoulder while the world turned outside. Happiness did not lie in having a perfect body or a perfect life. It lay in the wholeness of two hearts that chose to beat as one. It lay in the courage to see the truth and stay anyway. The road had been long, it had been filled with doubts and fears, it had stretched across an entire continent. But at the end of that road they had found something rare. They had found each other. The piano stood silent in the fading light. Robert held her hand. The music was over for the day. But for Robert and Martha, the symphony of their life together was only just beginning. True love is not about finding someone perfect, but about learning to see an imperfect world through a lens of grace and devotion. It is the courage to stay when the road gets difficult and the strength to become the support someone else needs. If this story moved your heart, please let us know where you are watching from in the comments, your city, your state, or your country. Your presence means the world to us, so feel free to like and subscribe for more touching tales. Now simply click on the video appearing on your screen to discover another journey of the heart.